Welcome everybody to the MOOC course on political theory, concepts and debates. Today's discussion will be on freedom of belief and freedom of expression. The lecture will have the following sections. We will first discuss a history of freedom of expression in the West. We shall then move on to freedom of expression in the Soviet Union. Then we shall discuss freedom of expression in non-Western societies. We shall also discuss the concept of freedom of belief and freedom of belief and expression in India, and then we shall conclude. Let us begin today's lecture by reading out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what it has to say about the freedom of expression and belief. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. However, we will see that these are not necessarily upheld in all societies and not in the best of conditions. Freedom of belief and expression are seen as noble goals and probably goals towards which all societies should strive towards. However, these values are not accepted universally and by all countries and societies. The following lecture will argue that freedom of belief and expression are fundamentally Western values. Other cultures have their own way of practicing pluralism, and that the notion of freedom of expression is actually quite arbitrary in its existence in the West. In a brief history of the freedom of expression, we shall note that it was enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution in 1791. Further, it was defended by John Stuart Mill in 1859. It was then affirmed by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. If we look at the history of freedom of expression in the West, we will find that it has been contentious and quite tumultuous in its existence. In the 4th century BCE, Plato sought to ban Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in Greece. Early Christians regularly destroyed the writings of their opponents. Byzantine iconoclasts in the 8th century demolished religious images that the Church did not approve of. The Catholic Church used propaganda and violence against Protestants, and thousands were killed in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. Thinkers like Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and others have supported state censorship for maintaining law and order. American civil liberties see free expression as a safeguard against state tyranny. This is a fundamentally negative connotation because tyranny is, of course, an expected value system in the West, and freedom of expression has been seen to be a safeguard against it, not as an accepted norm in these societies. The European notions of freedom of expression actually emerged from violence between Catholics and Protestants. We find that John Locke advocated religious toleration as a part of freedom of expression, and eventually, after the Enlightenment period of the 18th century, this became a defense of pluralism as a civic ideal, which means that it was only after the Enlightenment era that freedom of expression became an accepted value system in the West. We now move on to the freedom of expression and how it existed in the erstwhile Soviet Union of 1922 to 1991. The Soviet Union was a flagship communist state with a centralized control and limited freedom of expression. It had an agency called the Glavit, which was controlled by the Council of Ministers, who ensured ideological purity in all publications in the country. The Glavit annually published list of words prohibited in the Soviet publications and even mandated the censorship of certain books. Government permission was required to even write an article or print a visiting card. We finally see towards the end of the Soviet Union, with the policy of glasnost or openness, that Mikhail Gorbachev reduced these prohibitions but never actually got rid of the glavit. This is because the Soviet Union had a long history of almost a century of censorship, with Lenin decreeing in 1970 to ban all opposition publications till there was law and order restored in the Soviet Union. That freedom never eventually came, and the Soviet Union remained an authoritarian regime till the end. It is no surprise that this fostered the future Russian politics as an authoritarian state-controlled regime. When we look at non-European societies, we find that the European notions of European and American notions of freedom of speech are primarily emergent from authoritarian regimes. These regimes may openly promote pluralistic viewpoints, but they are actually rooted in Western developments, historical developments. In non-Western societies, we find that there is a priority to uphold justice against blasphemy and authoritarian regimes. This is not the norm in all societies, but however, we find that majority of societies in the non-West have been controlled through authoritarian techniques. For example, around 28 countries, Islamic countries, have laws against blasphemies, and some, like Pakistan and Iran, even practice the death penalty for it. Pakistan's blasphemy laws, for example, disproportionately target religious minorities, leading to many extrajudicial killings. Blasphemy laws are usually used to police community boundaries and reinforce power structures and curb all kinds of dissent. The Organization of Islamic Countries, OIC, opposes secular liberal notions of human rights and wanted to frame blasphemy as a law that would protect human rights. The OIC seeks to globally criminalize blasphemy, citing existing blasphemy laws in the European Union. The European courts uphold blasphemy laws regularly, and this is precisely the example that the OIC had used in order to uphold its desire to criminalize blasphemy in its own countries. We should then move on to freedom of belief. Freedom of belief is a problem in modern societies. People often use their right to freedom of belief to propagate patriarchal and violent practices. This, however, is not always the case, but it has been found to be frequent in most non-Western societies. We see how defenders of human rights often distinguish between religion and culture in their attempts to reform the kind of patriarchal and sectarian violence that freedom of religion allows in many societies, like the Middle East and other parts of South Asia. However, we must also acknowledge that it is the culture that has sometimes become a religious value, or that religious values often dictate what cultural norms would be present at a society at a given time. Thus, culture and religion cannot always be seen as separate parts of a society and often coexist. Therefore, reformations of one will be an attempt to reform the other, and this is where many nation states and international bodies find their job to be difficult when it comes to protecting both religion, freedom of belief, and freedom of expression simultaneously. We find that freedom of belief may not necessarily coexist with freedom of expression as we have found in the Western sense of the term. Cultural, religious, and other kinds of practices are often at odds with the freedom of expression, forcing reformers to reform the culture or dismissing oppressive practices as being culturally relative. What this means is that they would either blame the culture and say that this is a part of the cultural value system and ignore it, or they would often say that the religion that promotes such a practice will not be able to be reformed by them, or it is not their place to reform it. Of course, this is why, ultimately, the freedom of belief and freedom of religion, as we see in the West, which are two different concepts, are unable to coexist in most non-Western societies. Restrictions on freedom of belief and freedom of religion are common in most countries for the protection of public interests, human rights, and discriminatory reasons. For example, many countries regularly uphold majoritarian principles in their diktats on minority religions and also police free speech, especially in non-Western contexts. Governments are provided with the guidelines to intervene in the indoctrination of children into belief systems and restrict mandatory religious instruction in private schools. However, despite the international settings, international laws setting limitations on governments attempting to indoctrinate children in particular religious ideologies, they still keep happening in non-Western cultures. States do try to protect adolescents from predatory religious cults, but this may also violate the right to propagate religion through proselytization. It is always seen, especially in South Asia, in the Arab countries, in many other parts in sub-Saharan Africa, that the desire to uphold freedom of religion often violates other human rights. And perhaps to the West this is unacceptable, but in these countries it has become the cultural and religious norm to do so. Religious groups often keep violating human rights, and this is why this leads to a dilemma for state authorities and international human rights organizations. India is perhaps one of the few examples in the world where the majority community and its temples are under government control, while the minority institutions are exempt from such control. The government also promotes Islamic education in India through madrasas, but not traditional Hindu education, allowing religious minorities to enjoy significant freedoms when compared to the majority. This is perhaps quite strange a development when we look at the global scenario, but India will be a surprising entrant into this debate, as we will attempt to demonstrate in the sections later. We must also look at how international agencies deal with freedom of belief in different countries. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights and Freedom of Religion and Belief sees freedom of religion and belief as integral to all human rights and peace. However, Theo van Boven has criticized the Commission for being reluctant to address issues related to religious intolerance and discrimination and for being politically influenced. International bodies often struggle to solve issues related to freedom of belief due to biased lawmaking and their incompatibility with freedom of expression. The United Nations and many other human rights organizations repeatedly falter in their duties to uphold human rights because they are unable to intervene in the internal matters of non-democratic countries. And this leads many of these non-democratic countries, which are often led by religious leaders and cults, to practice a form of religion that is oppressive to minorities and women and even children in many instances. Thus, these international agencies may uphold a Western notion of freedom of expression and belief, and even the freedom of belief, but they do not necessarily protect these rights with the greatest commitment and dedication. At a recent case study from the country of Iran, while discussing our relation between the United Nations and human rights violations in the name of religion, in the name of freedom of religion, the world was shocked when Mahsa Amini was brutally murdered by the Iranian police for having taken off her hijab or headscarf in a public building. This had led to the development of a human rights violation which was protested heavily by young women and old women of Iran who took off their headscarves in public to protest against the tyranny of the religious regime in the country. Women and men all over the world condemned this issue, and social media, mass media, everything was flooded by instances of women taking off their headscarves in defiance of the brutally patriarchal regime that Iran propagated in order to safeguard its belief systems that led it to this oppressive juncture. Mahsa Amini became a hero, a martyr in the eyes of most women and men who strove to protect freedom of expression and belief in the world. However, the United Nations came to condemn this incident only after there was much outcry regarding it. Furthermore, all it did was remove Iran from the body of women's rights as a protest against this incident. This shows that the United Nations and other global bodies seeking to protect human rights often fail to uphold their duties to do so because their desire to not investigate or affirm their status in these countries allows many of these countries and regimes to propagate human rights violations in the name of religious freedom. This is why we see many instances in many parts of the world where religious minorities are brutally assaulted, with their rights being stripped off and taken for granted, but the United Nations remaining silent on these issues. Therefore, we see that Van Boven's criticism of the United Nations is not only valid, but alarming. We shall now move on to the Indian case, where we see that a large country with a diverse population such as India finds it difficult to have single notions of freedom of expression and even freedom of belief, as it is too diverse to be controlled and brought under a proper legal umbrella to be protected. Thus, we shall discuss a few case studies to see how India has failed in its task of upholding human rights as opposed to freedom of belief. For example, Taslima Nasreen, a writer from Bangladesh, was forced to flee the country when she had written a book which exposed the atrocities on Hindus there. She was later given asylum in West Bengal, which was under the Communist Party regime. But they failed to uphold her human rights when there were riots against her refuge in India, and they ultimately forced her to leave the state, and she now lives in a different part of India. Filmmaker Mani Ratnam had his house bombed and was in the hospital sustaining grievous injuries because his film Bombay of 1995 had depicted a Hindu man marrying a Muslim woman. The book Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is a global bestseller and a historical book, was banned with its theatrical productions prevented by the Communist Party regime in West Bengal during its long rule from 1977 to 2011. A Christian mob had attacked a store in 2006 when it kept copies of the Da Vinci Code on its bookshelves, despite it being a global bestseller. Contrary to expectations in Western liberal circles, the Indian state has struggled to protect individual freedom when faced with attacks from religious groups or political parties. Thus, we come to discuss a significant case study in the Indian case. Dinanath Batra in 2010 filed a case against a book by Wendy Doniger called The Hindus. He had placed a charge that the book sought to over-sexualize Hindu gods and goddesses with a Christian missionary zeal to defame the Hindu community and its practices. The lawsuit against Doniger was a culmination of anger against one of our students, Jeffrey Kripal, who in his doctoral dissertation had claimed that Ramakrishna Paramhansa, a renowned saint in India, a Hindu saint in India, was indulging in homoeroticism with many of his students, including the famed Hindu saint Swami Vivekananda. This was a way for the Hindu community, for members of the Hindu community, to attempt to defend their religion against attacks from what they perceived to be threats from other religious or secular entities. Cavillin has defended Doniger's rights to criticize Hinduism on account of the fact that she should be applauded for not bowing down to the gods. However, when we study the case, we see that Ramakrishna Paramhansa was one who upheld the right of many of people to pursue their own paths to divinity. And this is where Hinduism significantly differs from other Abrahamic religions. It allows people to pursue their path to God or divinity, or even towards atheism if they deem to do so. It does not have a well-articulated policy against blasphemy, and therefore it is also difficult to defend it in courts of law. We find that eminent thinker and politician Shashi Tharoor, in his book Why I'm a Hindu, which is a global bestseller published in 2018, has sought to show why Hinduism is a religion that is different, and why it is one of the perhaps few ideologies in the world that allow us to see how freedom of belief and freedom of expression can coexist. I read directly. Sanatan Dharma is inclusive since there is no basis for excluding any belief. Radhakrishnan argues that Hindu tolerance is not indifference. Hindus understand that not all self-declared truths are of equal value. Hindus tend to see non-Hindus' religious traditions as other, and in particular they do not see them as challenging or putting into doubt Hindu beliefs and practices. Unlike Hinduism, however, as we have seen, the Semitic or Abrahamic faiths believe themselves to be of divine origin. The true faith was revealed by God to Abraham and was therefore beyond contestation, even if its three major variants, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in order of appearance, relied on different texts. Thus, Tharoor makes a fundamental criticism of Abrahamic religions as opposed to Hinduism, in that he says that Hinduism is able to enshrine pluralist points of view, different points of view, under its umbrella, and accepts all of them as being equally valid. This is not the case in Abrahamic religions and non-Indian societies, where, as we have seen from our discussion so far, that freedom of belief and freedom of expression do not coexist, and in the West they only coexist because of certain arbitrary historical occurrences. In conclusion, we can say that the hypocrisies of the West and global bodies in dealing with human rights crises contribute to the persistence of regimes that curb the freedom of expression or belief in different parts of the world. Such disregard for fundamental rights raises concerns about the future and even the present, as the Masa Amini case demonstrates. There are numerous religious minorities in different parts of the world who seek the protection of international agencies and bodies, but these agencies and bodies do not necessarily indulge in such protection, as they would lead to different political issues and problems. Thus, many of these minorities are left to fend for themselves and cannot practice their freedom of expression because of the upholdment of others' rights of freedom of belief. It is perhaps only Hinduism that we see as a large and populous religion that has an inclusive belief system and does not see other faiths as challenging its core tenets. Hence, it lacks a well-articulated notion of blasphemy. Hinduism also lacks a central authority or notions of apostasy, making it one of the few religions in the world that does not doctrinally oppose the freedom of expression. Even the Doniger case, where the laws of blasphemy were used to ban the book by Doniger, were actually derived from a British law of 1857, which sought to criminalize blasphemy in order to protect the British dominion over India. Thus, we find perhaps that India may be able to show the way to the rest of the world when it comes to reconciling these two fundamentally irreconcilable value systems of belief of religion and belief of expression. Thank you. As we have seen so far in our discussion on freedom of expression and freedom of belief, we may be able to conclude that these cannot exist together in most societies. However, we must try to understand why that is the case. If one's belief system upholds the fundamental right to violate other people's freedoms in other ways and human rights in other ways, we may be able to see why freedom of religion cannot coexist with freedom of expression. What is important, however, is for us to understand that human rights are perhaps the most important aspects of any political discussion in this world, and upholding human rights should be the priority of international bodies and governments all over the world. Can we expect a future direction where this is possible? I believe that while these cannot coexist in the current political and social scenario in most parts of the world, we may try to have a reformative attitude towards religious groups, wherein they will be able to be more accepting towards differences of opinion, the existence of minority cultures, and different viewpoints of people. Otherwise, as we have seen in the Masa Amini case, while a regime may continue to harbor dictatorial policies and patriarchal attitudes towards women and children and minorities, the global bodies may not be able to protect these human rights that are so valuable to us. And it is because of this reason that we must try to see how we can reform religions from within to allow for a greater latitude to people who are not so indulgent to believe in religious indoctrination all over the world. This may also lead to a reduction in the way terrorism is conducted, and we may also be able to save numerous lives all over the world. With that, I would like to conclude.